Marcus Chen stepped off the transport shuttle and felt Earth's gravity pull at his bones in a way he'd almost forgotten. 5 years fighting the Kethran Empire across 3 star systems had changed him in ways that went deeper than the scars crisscrossing his arms or the cybernetic implant behind his left ear. The air tasted different here, cleaner, but somehow thinner than the recycled atmosphere of military ships. The spaceport buzzed with civilians going about their ordinary lives, completely unaware that humanity had been locked in a brutal war with an alien empire that viewed humans as nothing more than clever animals. Marcus watched families reuniting, business people hurrying to catch flights, and teenagers laughing over their datapads. None of them had seen friends vaporized by plasma cannons or held dying comrades in the vacuum of space. He pulled his military duffel bag over his shoulder and made his way through customs. The scanner beeped as it read his veteran status and service record. The customs officer, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, looked up from her screen with surprise. "Sergeant Chen, you served in the Outer Rim campaigns?" Her voice carried the reverence that civilians usually showed to war veterans, but Marcus had never gotten used to it. "Yes, ma'am." Marcus kept his response brief. He'd learned that most people couldn't handle the details of what actually happened out there in the dark between stars. "Welcome home, Sergeant. Thank you for your service." She waved him through without checking his bag. Marcus nodded and continued toward the exit. "Welcome home." The words felt strange. Home had been a cramped bunk on the UES Defiance for so long that he'd almost forgotten what his childhood bedroom looked like. His parents had sent messages regularly, updating him on life in Millbrook, the small town where he'd grown up. Everything sounded exactly the same, which somehow made it feel more foreign than the alien worlds he'd fought on. The automated taxi recognized his destination and pulled away from the spaceport. As they left the city behind, Marcus watched familiar landscapes roll past the windows. Green fields, old barns, and winding country roads that hadn't changed since he was 17. It was peaceful in a way that made his combat instincts twitch. After years of constant vigilance, trusting in such openness felt dangerous. His reflection in the window showed a stranger wearing his face. The boy who'd left Millbrook had been soft, uncertain, and desperate to escape what he saw as a dead-end life. The man returning had shoulders broadened by military training, eyes that moved constantly to assess threats, and hands that bore the calluses of weapon handling. The neural combat interface behind his ear, invisible beneath his hair, connected him to tactical networks that no longer existed on peaceful Earth. The taxi turned onto Maple Street, and Marcus felt his stomach tighten. Nothing had changed. The same white picket fences, the same carefully maintained lawns, the same sense that this place existed in a bubble separate from the rest of the universe. His parents' house came into view, and he saw his mother working in her garden. She looked older, more fragile than he remembered. Sarah Chen looked up as the taxi stopped and dropped her gardening tools. She ran toward him with tears already streaming down her face. Marcus caught her in a hug that felt both familiar and strange. She seemed so small now, so breakable. During the war, he'd often thought about this moment, but he'd forgotten how overwhelming it would feel to hold someone who wasn't wearing armor. My boy," she whispered against his chest. "You're so tall now, and so—" She pulled back to look at him, and he saw her searching his face for the son she remembered. "You're different. War changes people, Mom." It was the simplest truth he could offer. His father appeared in the doorway, moving more slowly than Marcus remembered. David Chen had always been the strong one, the rock of the family. But now Marcus could see the weight of years and worry in his posture. They embraced awkwardly, 2 men who'd both changed in different directions. "Welcome home, son. We're proud of you." His father's voice carried an emotion that Marcus had rarely heard before. Inside, the house felt like a museum of his childhood. His room had been preserved exactly as he'd left it, down to the posters of starfighters on the walls. Marcus sat on his old bed and looked around at relics of a person he barely remembered being. Model spaceships that he'd built with steady, peaceful hands. Books about adventure that seemed naive after living through real combat. A graduation photo where he looked impossibly young and hopeful. His parents hovered nearby, clearly wanting to talk, but uncertain how to bridge the gap that 5 years and a war had created. They asked careful questions about his service, and Marcus gave careful answers that revealed nothing about the nightmares that still woke him or the way his hand automatically reached for weapons that weren't there. "We were so worried when the news showed the fighting at Kepler Station," his mother said, setting down a cup of tea that tasted like childhood. "They said it was the worst battle of the war." Marcus had been there. He'd seen the station's outer ring explode and watched good soldiers die in the wreckage. He'd killed 17 Kethran warriors in hand-to-hand combat when their boarding party breached the command deck. The memory played behind his eyes every night, but he just nodded. It was rough, but we held the line. That evening, they sat around the dinner table like they used to, but the conversations felt stilted. His parents shared news about neighbors, local politics, and community events that seemed impossibly trivial after spending years where every decision affected life and death. Marcus found himself analyzing the room's tactical positions and exit routes, habits that had kept him alive but had no place at a family dinner. "Oh, I should mention," his father said, cutting into his pot roast, "you'll probably run into some of your old classmates around town. The Henderson's boy Derek is working at the bank now, and Jake Morrison got promoted to shift supervisor at the plant." Marcus's jaw tightened at those names. Derek Henderson and Jake Morrison, along with their friend Ryan Walsh, had made his high school years a living hell. They'd been the popular kids, the athletes, the ones who'd decided that Marcus was an acceptable target for their entertainment. 4 years of daily humiliation, physical intimidation, and social isolation that had driven him to join the military the day after graduation. "That's nice," Marcus managed, though his neural combat interface was automatically calculating threat assessments for each name. His mother must have noticed his tension. "Those boys have grown up, sweetie. Derek got married last year and Jake has 2 kids now. People change." Marcus nodded, but he doubted civilian life could change someone as much as war had changed him. The boys who'd shoved him into lockers and spread rumors about him were now men with jobs and families, living the same comfortable lives they'd always expected. Meanwhile, Marcus had spent 5 years learning 50 different ways to kill an enemy soldier and protecting a civilization that most people took for granted. After dinner, Marcus walked through the town center. Millbrook looked exactly the same, frozen in the prosperity and peace that most Earth communities enjoyed. The old movie theater still showed the same types of romantic comedies and action films. The ice cream shop still had a line of families with young children. The sports bar still had men gathered around screens, though now they were watching local athletics instead of war coverage. He passed the high school, a brick building that had once felt like a prison. The football field where Derek, Jake, and Ryan had been heroes still had fresh yard lines painted for the new season. Marcus remembered watching their games from the bleachers, invisible and alone, wondering what it would feel like to have that kind of confidence and social power. Now he knew what real power felt like. He'd commanded squads of soldiers in battles that determined the fate of colonies. He'd made split-second decisions that saved lives and taken responsibility for failures that cost them. He'd learned that true strength came not from intimidating the weak, but from protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The walk took him past Henderson's bank, where Derek presumably worked, and Morris in manufacturing, where Jake had his supervisor position. Both buildings looked prosperous and settled, representing the kind of stable, predictable lives that Marcus had once envied. Now they just seemed small and insular, existing because men and women like him had fought to preserve them. Marcus returned home to find his parents waiting with photo albums and scrapbooks. They'd saved every news article about the war, every mention of his unit, every official commendation that had been sent to families. Looking through them, Marcus realized how much his parents had lived through the war alongside him, experiencing their own kind of battle through worry and uncertainty. "We're so proud of you," his mother said, showing him a newspaper clipping about the Battle of Titan's Gate. "When we saw that your unit had received the Presidential Citation for Valor, we cried for hours." Marcus remembered that battle differently than the sanitized news report described it. He remembered the smell of burning metal and the sound of his sergeant choking on his own blood. He remembered the moment when he'd taken command of what was left of his squad and led them in a charge that broke the Kethrin line. The citation mentioned strategic brilliance and exceptional courage, but it didn't mention the 3 soldiers who died following his orders or the weight of their names on his conscience. "Thank you," he said, because it was what they needed to hear. His parents had suffered their own war, fighting battles of worry and helplessness that he couldn't diminish by sharing his trauma. That night, Marcus lay in his childhood bed and stared at the ceiling. The room was too quiet, too safe, too separated from the universe he'd learned to inhabit. His neural combat interface kept searching for tactical networks that didn't exist, leaving him feeling disconnected and isolated. The boy who'd grown up in this room had dreamed of adventure and heroism, never imagining that heroism usually meant watching friends die and making choices that haunted you forever. Outside his window, Millbrook slept in the same peaceful ignorance it had always enjoyed. The town that had felt like a trap when he was 17 now felt like a sanctuary that he'd helped preserve, but one where he no longer belonged. Marcus had become something different, something shaped by war and responsibility that couldn't be unpacked like clothes from a duffel bag. Tomorrow he would have to navigate this strange homecoming more fully. He would have to pretend to be the son his parents remembered while being the soldier he'd become. And somewhere in this small town, the boys who'd once made his life miserable were living their comfortable, unchanged lives, unaware that their former victim had returned as something they couldn't recognize or understand. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but his mind kept running tactical simulations and threat assessments. Home, he realized, wasn't a place you could return to after war had changed you. It was something you had to build again, one careful conversation and one difficult day at a time, while carrying the weight of everything you'd seen and done in defense of people who would never truly understand what that meant. 3 days into his homecoming, Marcus decided to venture into town alone. His parents meant well, but their constant hovering and careful questions were suffocating. They treated him like he might break or disappear, and their worry was becoming another weight to carry alongside everything else. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of perfect Earth day that he'd dreamed about while stationed on the sulfur-soaked mining colonies of the Outer Rim. He walked down Main Street, noting how his enhanced reflexes cataloged every person, every potential exit, every object that could serve as cover or weapon. The neural combat interface had become so integrated into his thinking that he couldn't turn off the tactical analysis, even in the safest place on Earth. The coffee shop was new since he'd left, a trendy place called Bean There that served expensive drinks with names he didn't recognize. Marcus ordered a simple black coffee and found a corner table where he could observe the room while keeping his back to a wall. Old habits from a war that civilians would never understand. "Marcus Chen? Holy shit. Is that really you?" The voice made Marcus's spine straighten with instinctive alertness. He turned to see Derek Henderson approaching, looking older but essentially unchanged. Derek had the same confident swagger, the same easy smile that had charmed teachers and intimidated classmates. He wore an expensive suit that spoke of success and social status, everything that 17-year-old Marcus had envied and feared. Derek. Marcus stood, and immediately noticed that he was now several inches taller than his former tormentor. War and military conditioning had filled out his frame, giving him a presence that made Derek pause slightly in his approach. "Man, look at you. You're huge now." Derek's tone carried the same casual dominance it always had, but there was something else there. A slight uncertainty that hadn't existed in high school. "I heard you went military after graduation. How'd that work out?" Marcus studied Derek's face, looking for signs of the cruelty that had made 4 years of his life miserable. The same pale blue eyes, the same perfectly styled blonde hair, the same assumption that everyone around him existed for his entertainment. But there was something softer now. Something that spoke of a life lived within safe boundaries. It worked out fine. Marcus kept his response neutral, though his enhanced reflexes were noting Derek's stance, the way he held his hands, the closest escape routes. Combat thinking applied to a coffee shop conversation with a childhood bully. "Come on, sit down. Let me buy you a real drink. They've got this great espresso here." Derek gestured to Marcus's simple coffee with the same dismissive attitude he'd once used to criticize Marcus's clothes or lunch money. Marcus remained standing. "I'm fine with what I have." Derek laughed, a sound that triggered memories of being laughed at in hallways and locker rooms. "Still the same old Marcus, I guess. Always so serious about everything. Remember how uptight you used to get about homework and grades? We always said you needed to learn how to relax." The word "we" hung in the air like a threat. Jake and Ryan weren't here, but Derek spoke as if their old dynamic still existed, as if the social hierarchy of high school was still relevant. Marcus felt his jaw tighten as memories surfaced unbidden, being shoved down the stairs while Derek laughed with his friends. Having his backpack dumped in the mud while Derek explained that it was just a joke. Being excluded from group projects, social events, and basic human dignity while Derek and his crew treated him like entertainment. The daily grinding humiliation that had convinced Marcus that he was worth less than other people. "I remember a lot of things," Marcus said quietly. Derek either didn't catch the edge in Marcus's voice or chose to ignore it. "You know what you should do? Come to Jake's barbecue this weekend. He's got this great place now, pool and everything. All the old gang will be there. It'll be like old times." Like old times. The phrase echoed with threat and casual cruelty. Marcus's neural combat interface was running probability calculations, assessing Derek as a potential threat despite the civilian setting. Part of him wanted to explain exactly what old times had meant to him, what those daily humiliations had cost in terms of self-worth and social development. "I'll think about it," Marcus said, which was easier than explaining that he'd rather face another Catherine assault than voluntarily put himself back into that social dynamic. "Great. Jake will be so excited to see you. We always wondered what happened to you after graduation. Just disappeared, you know. One day you were there, next day gone." Derek's tone suggested that Marcus's absence had been an interesting curiosity rather than an escape from years of systematic bullying. "I had things to do." Derek laughed again. "Always so mysterious. Some things never change, I guess." He pulled out his phone and glanced at the time. "Listen, I've got to run. Bank business. You know how it is. But definitely think about that barbecue. Ryan's bringing his boat and we're going to do some water skiing. Just like the old lake parties, except now we can actually afford the good beer." Marcus remembered those lake parties from high school. He'd never been invited, of course. He'd learned about them through overheard conversations and social media posts that made it clear he wasn't welcome. The exclusion had been casual and complete, a social death that Derek and his friends had administered without thought or conscience. "I'll let you know," Marcus repeated. Derek clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture that would have once made Marcus flinch. Now Marcus's body remained perfectly still, controlled by reflexes trained for combat situations where any movement could mean life or death. Derek's hand lingered a moment longer than it should have, and Marcus saw something flicker across his face. Confusion, maybe, or the recognition that something fundamental had changed. "Good seeing you, man. Really good." Derek's smile was a little less confident now, a little more uncertain. "And hey, thanks for your service and all that. Must have been quite an experience." Quite an experience? Marcus almost laughed at the inadequacy of the phrase. 5 years of war, death, and responsibility reduced to something that sounded like a vacation or hobby. But Derek's understanding was limited to what he'd seen in movies and news reports. He had no framework for comprehending what Marcus had actually lived through. After Derek left, Marcus sat back down and tried to process the encounter. Physically, Derek hadn't changed much beyond the natural aging that came with adult responsibilities. But there was something different in his manner, a subtle uncertainty that suggested life hadn't been as smooth as his confident exterior implied. Marcus finished his coffee and walked to the town square, where a small memorial honored local veterans. His name was there on a brass plaque, along with others who'd served in the recent war. Someone had left fresh flowers, and Marcus wondered who in town cared enough to remember soldiers they'd never met. "Marcus? Marcus Chen?" He turned to see Mrs. Patterson, his old English teacher, approaching with a warm smile. She looked exactly as he remembered, gray-haired and kind-eyed, the sort of teacher who'd actually cared about her students' well-being. "Mrs. Patterson?" Marcus found himself genuinely pleased to see her, one of the few adults from his high school years who'd shown him consistent kindness. "I heard you were back in town. How are you adjusting to civilian life?" Her question was gentle but perceptive, and Marcus realized she was one of the few people who might understand that coming home from war was its own kind of battle. "It's different than I expected." She nodded knowingly. "My brother came back from Vietnam when I was young. He said the hardest part wasn't the war itself, but trying to explain it to people who'd never left their comfort zone." She gestured toward the memorial. "We're proud of what you've done, Marcus. All of you who served." "Thank you. That means more than you know." "I also remember what high school was like for you," she said quietly. "I hope you know that some of us saw what was happening. I tried to intervene when I could, but the administration didn't always take bullying as seriously as they should have." Marcus felt something loosen in his chest. For years he'd wondered if any adult had noticed his daily humiliation, or if he'd been as invisible to them as he'd felt to his peers. "I know you tried. It helped, having at least one person who seemed to care. Those boys who gave you trouble, they're still around town. Derek works at his father's bank. Jake runs a division at the plant. Ryan manages his family's construction business. They've done well for themselves, but I sometimes wonder if they ever think about the cost of their success to others." It was as close to a criticism as Mrs. Patterson would probably ever voice, and Marcus appreciated her discretion. She was telling him that she remembered, that she understood the context of any encounters he might have in town. "People change," Marcus said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "Some do. Others just get better at hiding who they've always been." She patted his arm gently. "Be careful, Marcus. Coming home should be a time of healing, not reopening old wounds." After Mrs. Patterson left, Marcus walked through the residential neighborhoods where he'd grown up. The houses looked smaller than he remembered, the distances shorter, the whole environment more contained and predictable. During the war, he'd dreamed of this kind of safety and stability. Now that he was living it, he felt trapped and restless. He found himself standing outside Derek Henderson's house, a large colonial with perfectly manicured landscaping, and two expensive cars in the driveway. Through the front window, he could see Derek moving around inside, probably preparing for dinner with his wife. It looked comfortable and settled, the life that Derek had always expected to have. Marcus's enhanced vision caught details that civilian eyes would miss. The security system was basic, designed to deter casual burglars rather than determined attackers. The house had multiple entry points and limited defensive positions. The neighborhood was isolated enough that screams wouldn't immediately attract attention. He shook his head, disturbed by the automatic tactical analysis. Derek wasn't an enemy combatant, he was just a man living his life, probably unaware that his former victim had developed the skills and mindset to be genuinely dangerous. The boy who'd been pushed around in high school had become someone who could end threats efficiently and without hesitation. Marcus turned away from Derek's house and headed home, troubled by his own thoughts. The neural combat interface had been designed to keep soldiers alive in hostile environments, but it was malfunctioning in peaceful settings, turning every social interaction into a potential battle scenario. At dinner, his parents asked about his day in town, and Marcus gave them a sanitized version that emphasized the positive encounters while omitting his reaction to seeing Derek. They were relieved that he was beginning to reconnect with his hometown, interpreting his restlessness as a sign of healthy adjustment rather than the underlying tension it actually represented. "Derek Henderson always seemed like such a nice boy," his mother commented. "His mother says he's doing very well at the bank. Maybe you two can reconnect as adults." Marcus nodded and said nothing. His parents had never fully understood the social dynamics of his high school years, interpreting his isolation as shyness rather than systematic exclusion. They remembered Derek as polite and well-mannered, the public face he'd shown to adults while tormenting their son. That evening, Marcus sat in his room and tried to process the strange collision between his past and present selves. The boy who'd lived in this room had been weak, isolated, and desperate for acceptance. The man sitting here now had commanded respect through competence and courage, earning his place through sacrifice and service rather than social manipulation. But Derek's casual assumption that their old dynamic still existed troubled him. It suggested that Derek saw him as fundamentally unchanged, still the awkward teenager who could be dismissed and controlled. The thought of attending Jake's barbecue, of voluntarily putting himself back into that social environment, filled Marcus with a tension that had nothing to do with combat reflexes and everything to do with unresolved trauma. Marcus realized that coming home meant more than readjusting to civilian life. It meant confronting the person he'd been before the war, the wounds that had driven him to military service, and the question of whether the strength he'd gained through combat could protect him from the subtler warfare of social hierarchy and casual cruelty. The war had ended, but Marcus was beginning to understand that his real battle was just beginning. Marcus spent the week avoiding downtown and the possibility of running into Jake Morrison or Ryan Walsh. He wasn't ready for more encounters that would drag up memories he'd spent 5 years trying to bury under combat experience and military achievement. But small towns had their own gravitational pull, and Friday afternoon found him at Sullivan's Hardware, helping his father pick out materials for a home repair project. "Marcus Chen! Well, I'll be damned!" The voice was deeper than Marcus remembered, roughened by years of cigarettes and job site yelling, but unmistakably Jake Morrison. Marcus turned to see a man who'd filled out considerably since high school, thick through the shoulders and gut, wearing work clothes that spoke of manual labor rather than office comfort. Jake's face showed the weathering of outdoor work, but his eyes held the same aggressive confidence that had made him the most physically intimidating of Marcus's 3 tormentors. "Jake." Marcus set down the paint can he'd been examining and faced his former classmate. His enhanced reflexes automatically cataloged Jake's stance, reach, and the heavy wrench hanging from his tool belt that could serve as a weapon. "Heard you were back in town. Derek said he saw you at that fancy coffee place." Jake's tone carried a hint of mockery, suggesting that coffee shops were somehow pretentious or effeminate. Never figured you for a military man. Always seemed more like the type who'd sit behind a desk somewhere. The casual dismissal triggered memories of gym class humiliations, of being picked last for every team, of Jake's particular talent for making physical weakness seem like moral failure. Marcus had been thin and uncoordinated as a teenager, an easy target for someone who'd learned to use size and aggression to establish dominance. "People change," Marcus said, noting how Jake had positioned himself to block the aisle, a subtle intimidation tactic that probably worked well on construction sites and job disputes. Jake laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the hardware store's metal shelving. "Do they, though? I mean, you look bigger, sure, military training and all that, but underneath, you're still the same guy who used to jump every time someone raised their voice." As if to demonstrate his point, Jake suddenly slapped his hand against a metal shelf, creating a sharp bang that echoed through the store. Marcus didn't flinch. His body remained perfectly still, controlled by reflexes trained to distinguish between actual threats and psychological intimidation. The lack of reaction clearly surprised Jake, who'd expected to see the old fearful response. "Interesting," Marcus said quietly. Jake's confidence wavered slightly. "Look, don't take it personal. High school was just high school, you know? Kids being kids. We were all just figuring things out back then. Kids being kids. The phrase that adults always use to minimize systematic cruelty, as if being young somehow excused the deliberate infliction of psychological damage." Marcus remembered being cornered in bathroom stalls, having his books knocked from his hands, being subjected to daily verbal abuse that had convinced him he was fundamentally worthless as a human being. "I remember it differently," Marcus said. "Come on, man, it wasn't that bad. You're being dramatic." Jake's voice carried the dismissive tone of someone who'd never been on the receiving end of sustained bullying, who couldn't imagine that his entertainment had been someone else's trauma. Marcus studied Jake's face, looking for signs of genuine remorse or self-awareness. Instead, he saw the same entitled assumption that his perspective was the only one that mattered, that his victims should be grateful for his attention, even when it was cruel. "You broke my nose once," Marcus said conversationally. "Sophomore year, outside the gymnasium. You said it was an accident, but we both know you did it deliberately." Jake shifted uncomfortably, glancing around to see if anyone else in the store was listening. "That was an accident. I was just horsing around and you got in the way. You followed me outside specifically to continue an argument. You shoved me hard enough to slam my face into a concrete wall. The school nurse said it was a clean break, probably from targeted impact rather than a fall." The specificity seemed to surprise Jake, who clearly wasn't used to having his past actions analyzed with such precision. Most of his victims had probably learned to minimize and forget, rather than remember with perfect clarity. "Look, if I hurt you back then, I'm sorry. We were kids. I didn't know any better." The apology came out forced and defensive, more concerned with Jake's discomfort than Marcus's past pain. Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. The neural combat interface was running threat assessments and probability calculations, analyzing Jake as a potential enemy combatant despite the civilian environment. Part of him wanted to explain exactly what he'd learned about violence in the years since high school, what he'd become capable of when dealing with people who hurt others. "Apology noted," Marcus said instead. Jake seemed to interpret this as acceptance and relaxed slightly. "Good, good. Derek mentioned that barbecue at my place this weekend. You should definitely come. Bring a date if you want, though I guess you probably haven't had time to meet anyone yet. Right?" The casual assumption that Marcus was still socially awkward, still the isolated teenager who couldn't attract female attention, sparked a flash of anger that Marcus carefully controlled. During the war, he'd earned the respect and companionship of soldiers who didn't care about high school social hierarchies or civilian status symbols. "I'll consider it," Marcus said, which seemed like the path of least resistance. Great. It'll be fun catching up with everyone. Ryan's bringing his new boat, and we've got some great stories to share. Adult stories, if you know what I mean. Jake winked with the same crude humor that had made him popular among certain classmates who confused cruelty with charisma. After Jake left, Marcus's father appeared from another aisle, carrying the materials they'd come to buy. Everything all right? You looked tense talking to that young man. Just catching up with an old classmate. Marcus helped carry the purchases to the checkout counter, noting how his hands remained perfectly steady despite the adrenaline response triggered by the encounter. At dinner, his mother brought up the invitation to Jake's barbecue, apparently having heard about it through the efficient communication network that small towns maintained. She seemed pleased that Marcus was being included in social activities, interpreting it as a sign of healthy reintegration. It might be good for you to spend time with people your own age, she said, serving him a second helping of meatloaf. You've been so serious since you came home. A little fun might help you relax. Marcus nodded and said nothing. His parents meant well, but they couldn't understand that relaxation was a luxury he'd learned to live without. The hypervigilance that kept him alive during the war had become so integrated into his thinking that he couldn't simply turn it off for social gatherings. That night, Marcus lay awake analyzing the day's encounters. Derek's casual dismissal of their past dynamic, Jake's aggressive attempt to re-establish dominance, and the underlying assumption that high school social hierarchies were still relevant. They seemed to view him as fundamentally unchanged, still the weak target they remembered, despite obvious evidence to the contrary. Saturday morning brought a text from Derek. Hey man, barbecue starts at 2. Jake's place on Lakeside Drive. Can't wait to catch up properly. Marcus stared at the message for a long time. Part of him wanted to ignore the invitation, to avoid voluntarily entering a social situation designed by and for people who'd made his adolescence miserable. But another part of him, the part trained for combat and conditioned for confrontation, was curious about how this encounter would play out. At 1:45 p.m., Marcus drove to Lakeside Drive. Jake's house was a large ranch-style home with an expansive backyard that sloped down to the lake. Cars filled the driveway and lined the street, suggesting a substantial gathering. Through the backyard gate, Marcus could see people clustered around a swimming pool, hear music playing and voices raised in laughter. He sat in his car for several minutes, analyzing the scene like a tactical situation. Multiple entry and exit points, open terrain with limited cover, large number of potential civilians who could complicate any conflict. The neural combat interface was treating this like a mission briefing, which probably wasn't healthy for a social gathering. Marcus got out of his car and walked through the backyard gate. The party was in full swing, with perhaps 30 people scattered around the pool area and patio. He recognized some faces from high school, people who'd been part of Derek, Jake, and Ryan's social circle. They looked older, softer, marked by years of comfortable living and predictable routines. Marcus, you made it! Derek appeared with a beer in each hand, wearing swim shorts and a polo shirt that emphasized his recent weight gain. Come meet everyone. They can't wait to hear war stories. War stories. As if 5 years of combat and death could be reduced to entertaining anecdotes for people drinking beer around a swimming pool. Marcus accepted the offered drink, but didn't open it, preferring to keep his reflexes unimpaired. There he is, the war hero! Jake's voice boomed across the patio, drawing attention from the other guests. He approached with the swagger of a man performing for his audience, playing the role of gracious host, welcoming an old friend. Marcus found himself the center of attention as Jake introduced him around the party. The other guests looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and awkward respect, clearly uncertain how to interact with someone who'd actually been to war. Most of their questions were superficial, focused on exotic locations and equipment, rather than the reality of combat. "Did you ever kill anyone?" asked Tom Bradley, who'd been a minor member of the popular crowd in high school. The question came out slightly slurred, suggesting he'd been drinking for a while. The party conversation suddenly quieted, everyone waiting for Marcus's response. He could feel their eagerness for dramatic details, their hunger for second-hand thrills that would let them feel connected to something dangerous without experiencing any actual risk. Marcus looked around the circle of expectant faces, seeing people who'd lived comfortable, insulated lives, while he and others like him had fought to preserve that comfort. They wanted war stories the way they wanted action movies, as entertainment rather than education. "Yes," Marcus said simply. The single word seemed to create a bubble of silence around him. Several people shifted uncomfortably, apparently expecting a more dramatic or detailed response. The reality of taking human life wasn't as entertaining as they'd anticipated. "Must have been intense," Derek said, trying to fill the awkward silence. "I can't even imagine what that would be like." "No," Marcus agreed. "You can't." Ryan Walsh chose that moment to make his entrance, emerging from the house with a woman Marcus didn't recognize. Ryan had always been the most socially aware of the three bullies, smart enough to be cruel without appearing obviously malicious. He'd perfected the art of exclusion and psychological manipulation, making his victims feel like their isolation was their own fault. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," Ryan said, approaching with the easy confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the social hierarchy. "Marcus Chen, our hometown hero. I heard you've been off playing soldier." Playing soldier. The dismissive phrase sparked something dangerous in Marcus's chest, a flash of anger that his training immediately recognized as a threat to mission parameters. Around the galaxy, he'd seen good people die protecting the comfortable ignorance that Ryan's life represented, and hearing their sacrifice reduced to play was almost intolerable. "Something like that," Marcus said, his voice carrying an edge that made several people nearby glance at him with new uncertainty. Ryan either didn't notice the warning tone or chose to ignore it. "Well, we've all been fighting our own battles here at home. The mortgage crisis, the recession, dealing with regulations and bureaucracy, different kinds of warfare, you know?" Comparing mortgage payments to actual combat was so absurd that Marcus almost laughed. Instead, he studied Ryan's face, noting the soft features and manicured appearance of someone who'd never experienced genuine physical threat or life-threatening responsibility. "I'm sure it's been very challenging," Marcus said with perfect sincerity that somehow sounded more threatening than sarcasm. The conversation continued around him, but Marcus found himself analyzing the social dynamics with the same systematic attention he'd once applied to battlefield intelligence. Derek, Jake, and Ryan still moved through their social environment with the casual entitlement of people who'd never had their assumptions challenged. They commanded attention, dominated conversations, and treated others as supporting characters in their personal narratives. "You know what we should do?" Jake announced, his voice carrying across the patio. "We should play some pool volleyball, just like old times. Remember those games we used to play?" Marcus remembered those games differently than Jake apparently did. He remembered being deliberately excluded, sitting on pool chairs while the popular kids played elaborate games that seemed designed more for social positioning than actual fun. He remembered the casual way they'd made it clear that he wasn't welcome to participate. "Come on, Marcus," Derek called out. "You're on my team. Let's see if all that military training made you any more athletic." The challenge was offered with a smile, but Marcus heard the underlying assumption that he was still the uncoordinated teenager they remembered. Several other guests had gathered around the pool, clearly expecting entertainment from watching the returned soldier struggle with a simple game. Marcus looked around at the expectant faces, seeing people who'd never had to prove themselves beyond the safe boundaries of their comfortable lives. They wanted to see if the boy they'd once dismissed was still weak beneath his new exterior, if their old social hierarchies remained intact despite his military service. "Sure," Marcus said, setting down his unopened beer. The game began with typical adult party enthusiasm, lots of laughter and good-natured trash talk. But Marcus quickly noticed that the dynamics hadn't changed as much as the participants probably thought. Derek, Jake, and Ryan still dominated the play, still treated others as supporting cast, still assumed that their natural superiority would assert itself. They'd positioned Marcus on Derek's team in a way that would showcase any athletic inadequacy, clearly expecting to demonstrate that some things never changed. What they got instead was a demonstration of exactly how much some things could change. Military conditioning had given Marcus reflexes, coordination, and spatial awareness that went far beyond civilian athletics. His enhanced reaction time, trained through combat scenarios, made pool volleyball look like slow motion. The neural combat interface automatically calculated trajectories, predicted opponent movements, and optimized his positioning with machine-like precision. The first few points were competitive, with both teams trading scores while the observers cheered and offered commentary. But as the game continued, it became clear that Marcus was operating on a different level than the other players. He moved with economical precision, never wasting motion, placing shots with surgical accuracy that left opponents scrambling uselessly. "Jesus, Marcus," panted Jake after missing another perfectly placed shot. "Where'd you learn to play like that?" "Physical conditioning was part of military training," Marcus replied, preparing for the next serve with mechanical efficiency. What had started as entertainment was becoming something else. The casual laughter died away as it became obvious that Marcus wasn't just winning. He was dominating in a way that made the other players look clumsy and amateur. Derek's confident smile faded as he repeatedly found himself out of position, unable to respond to shots that seemed to materialize exactly where he wasn't. The final point came when Ryan attempted an aggressive spike that should have been unreturnable. Marcus moved with fluid precision, diving to make an impossible save that he converted into a counterattack so perfectly placed that Ryan could only watch it sail past him into the water. Game over. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of water lapping against the pool edges. Marcus stood in the shallow end, breathing easily while his opponents gasped for air. Around the pool, the other party guests shifted uncomfortably, apparently uncertain how to respond to such a thorough demonstration of superiority. "Good game," Marcus said, offering his hand to Derek. Derek shook it automatically, but Marcus could see something new in his expression. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a wariness that suggested Derek was beginning to understand that the dynamics he'd taken for granted might no longer apply. As Marcus climbed out of the pool, he noticed that the other guests were looking at him differently. The awkward respect he'd seen earlier had been replaced by something that looked almost like fear. They'd expected the old Marcus, weak and easily dominated, and instead they'd seen something they didn't recognize or understand. "That was quite a performance," Ryan said, his voice carefully neutral. "Guess all that training really paid off." Marcus toweled off and looked around at the faces surrounding him. Derek, Jake, and Ryan stood together, unconsciously forming the same pack formation they'd used in high school to intimidate isolated targets. But now they looked smaller somehow, less certain of their place in the social hierarchy they'd once ruled. "Training has its benefits," Marcus agreed. The party continued around them, but the atmosphere had shifted. People seemed less eager to engage Marcus in conversation, less interested in hearing war stories that might reveal more about the person he'd become. The comfortable social dynamics they'd expected had been disrupted by the realization that their former victim was now something they couldn't control or dismiss. Marcus stayed for another hour, making polite conversation and observing the subtle ways that everyone's behavior toward him had changed. Derek's casual dismissal had been replaced by careful politeness. Jake's aggressive confidence had turned into wary respect. Ryan's social manipulation had given way to genuine uncertainty about how to interact with someone who no longer fit into his established categories. As he prepared to leave, Derek approached him in the driveway, away from the other guests. "Listen, Marcus, about high school and everything." Derek's voice trailed off as he seemed to struggle with words he'd never had to say before. "Maybe we were harder on you than we should have been." Marcus studied Derek's face, noting the discomfort and genuine uncertainty there. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was an acknowledgement that their past behavior might have been wrong. "Maybe," Marcus agreed. "We were just kids, you know? We didn't really understand how our actions affected other people." Derek's explanation came out hurried, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as Marcus. "Understanding is something you learn," Marcus said, "if you want to." Derek nodded, though Marcus wasn't sure he really understood what he was agreeing with. "Well, it was good seeing you again. Really good. I hope we can... I'd like to think we could be friends now, as adults." Marcus looked at Derek for a long moment, seeing a man who'd lived his entire life within the comfortable boundaries of social privilege, who'd never had his assumptions truly challenged or his behavior seriously questioned. The war had taught Marcus about real friendship, forged in combat and tested by shared sacrifice. What Derek was offering was something much smaller and more conditional. "We'll see," Marcus said. Driving home through the familiar streets of his childhood, Marcus reflected on the strange collision between past and present. The boys who'd once tormented him were now men with mortgages and responsibilities, but their fundamental understanding of the world hadn't changed much. They still saw strength as dominance, still treated others as supporting characters in their personal narratives, still assumed that their perspective was the only one that mattered. But they'd also seen something today that confused and unsettled them. The weak target they remembered had become something they couldn't easily categorize or control. The comfortable social hierarchies they'd taken for granted had been disrupted by the realization that real strength came from sources they'd never encountered. Marcus understood now that coming home meant more than readjusting to civilian life. It meant choosing what kind of person he wanted to be in a world that no longer needed the warrior he'd become. The skills and mindset that had kept him alive in combat were still part of him, but they didn't have to define him. He'd proven that he was no longer the victim they remembered. Now he had to decide what to do with that knowledge, and whether the man he'd become could find a place in the peaceful world he'd fought to preserve. The boy who'd left Millbrook had been running from weakness and humiliation. The man returning had learned that true strength came not from dominating others, but from protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. It was a lesson that Derek, Jake, and Ryan might someday understand, but only if they chose to learn it. Marcus pulled into his parents' driveway and sat in the car for a moment, looking at the house where that frightened, isolated teenager had once lived. He'd carried those wounds into war and let combat transform them into something harder and more dangerous. But now he had the chance to transform them again, into something better. Home, he realized, wasn't about returning to who he'd been. It was about choosing who he wanted to become, using everything he'd learned to build something stronger and more meaningful than the pain he'd carried for so long. The war had ended, but his real victory was just beginning.